Here at the Royal Ontario Museum, or ROM, we love to talk about climate change. It's actually in my job title. I'm Soren Brothers, the Allan and Helaine Shiff Curator of Climate Change at ROM. And I'm standing right now in Noel Hamlin Lifers, which is an immersive art installation by local artist Noel Hamlin, which explores the impact of fast fashion and global textile industry on climate change. We also have the Life in Crisis Shad Gallery of Biodiversity, which looks at the impact of climate change on biodiversity loss around the world. And even our Dawn of Life gallery looks at how climate change has played a role in historical mass extinctions across the planet. Basically, I talk about climate change all day, every day, and there's a lot of good reasons to talk about climate change. But today, we actually wanted to make a video where we talked about why we might stop talking about climate change in some of our communications. The first reason that we might want to start limiting how much we talk about climate change or stop talking about climate change in our programs and conversations is that climate change can be a really charged space to begin with. And it's not just people who are dismissive of climate change who are going to be excluding themselves from climate change programs, but also people who are maybe alarmed at climate change and they're concerned and struggling with eco-anxiety and they don't want to hear more about what kind of impacts they're going to be facing in their lives with climate change. So if we want to try and bring more people into the climate change conversation to start with, how do we have a conversation that deals with climate change without addressing it directly? One way is actually looking at where I am right now. I'm in the heart of downtown Toronto, and we are in a neighborhood that is highly desirable. There's actually a wait list that people spend decades on to try and have a chance to buy a house in this location, in this neighborhood. And there's a lot of good reasons that a lot of people across the political spectrum want to live in a neighborhood like this. This is a serene place. Actually, a local once told me he considered it a place of healing. It's a safe neighborhood. It's tightly connected community. And there's also a really big reason that this community is especially unusual in North America. And that's the fact that it's car-free. You may have noticed that there's no cars around here. It's very quiet because of that. And it's actually illegal to build car-free communities in most places in North America, which makes this actually the largest urban car-free community in the continent. And the only reason it exists is actually because we're on an island off the coast, downtown Toronto. So looping back to what kind of conversations we can have when it comes to climate change without talking about climate change, we can talk about all of the reasons that car-free communities and neighborhoods such as this one are really important for climate change mitigation and decarbonizing and phasing out fossil fuels. But we also don't have to talk about that. We can talk about all of the other reasons that a lot of people would want to live in a place like this. And it might be that that actually brings around faster and less politicized and less charged progress towards accelerating this. The second reason that we might want to stop talking about climate change is that once we actually get to this new conversation about our shared values and the way that we want to live, it actually opens up maybe a broader and more important conversation about not just carbon budgeting and getting to net zero, but about our relationship with the planet, which is really what climate change is at the heart of. And we can think about, for instance, electric vehicles and having car-free neighborhoods as two different pathways that we could take to get to net zero as a society. But in terms of the quality of life that's associated with them, in terms of the impacts on biodiversity and climate justice and other elements, they might have very different outcomes, thinking about, for instance, the mining requirements of electric vehicles, or the cost, the financial cost of maintaining heavy infrastructure for cars, or even thinking about, for instance, road salt applications and the associated impact on aquatic ecosystems. So it's really nice to be able to get to this broader conversation that can actually then help guide us in terms of how we really want to address climate change when it comes down to what choices we're making today. And there's also another reason why we might not want to have climate change per se at front and center of our conversations and museum programs. And that's because climate change can actually be difficult to define in terms of optimism and pessimism, as I mentioned earlier. But if you're actually focusing on the benefits of the things that we're doing, of the improvements that we're making to our societies, to our air quality, to our water quality, if those are what you're assessing your optimism or pessimism by, that can actually give you a real valid, immediate, honest source of optimism for the situations that we're creating as a society and for local biodiversity. So a good example of actually how this is even played out is in Ontario. We had a phase out of coal for electricity generation from 2005 to 2014. Climate change was already too politicized at that point to be a driver that got political support in Ontario for phasing it out. But air quality was something that everyone could get behind, and the benefits to the public from improved air quality by phasing out coal were immediate. So in 2005, you actually had over 30 days per year of smog days and smog alerts where people weren't supposed to go outside, and by 2014 it was zero. So you had these really nice things that people could actually feel good about and feel optimistic about and see as societal benefits, regardless of whether you're doing it because of climate change. That phase out of coal that Ontario did during that period remains the largest climate change mitigation action to date on the continent. Around the world, we're at a time of really immense change right now. Societal change, the way that we're structuring our habitats, our environments, are all changing. And I'm right now looking over at Villiers Island. This is at the Portland's Flood Protection Project in downtown Toronto. And it's a really great example of how spectacular some of these changes can be. So this is a roughly $1.3 billion project that's redefining the mouth of the Don River. The Don River was once Canada's most polluted river, but we're spending another $3 billion to actually clean up the river so it'll be swimmable in the future. And this is going to be a flood-resilient neighborhood and a climate-resilient neighborhood that's being designed to be built within this area. It's been said that this might be the largest urban climate adaptation project currently underway on the planet, but most people in Toronto aren't even familiar with it being here right now. So as a museum, we're trying to do what we can to actually bring public awareness that these things are happening, that we have improved natural environments that are coming as a result of our response to climate change, but again, they're intrinsically good and they're going to be exciting places for families to hang out, versus what this was previously, which was an industrialized, heavily polluted zone. And that kind of transformation that we're seeing, again, is a really great positive source of optimism. What happened with the Don River historically in Toronto is that it was channelized, and so this had been the largest wetlands actually of the Great Lakes complex. And now we're starting to see those wetlands come back, where they've actually, through this construction effort, they've recovered 100-year-old cattails that are now being planted in new wetlands that, for instance, my daughters and my grandchildren would be able to enjoy, and you'll be able to access by kayak and by canoe. It's easy to think that what's happening at places like the Portland's Flood Protection Project here are just climate action and not much more, but they're actually way more important than that. I, for instance, have optimism that this is the first spot that I'm going to be going kayaking in the Don River in a couple of years when it's available to us. And I think a lot of people in the city of Toronto would have that same sense of optimism, that same sense of excitement, if they knew that this was happening. And one of the things that's really surprised me working at the museum is realizing how many people in the public and even people working with government don't understand that this is happening right here and the scope of what we're doing. And again, how exciting it is and what an intrinsically positive change it is for our city and what a turning point it is for how we actually interact with our waters here, turning them from an industrial waste site to a place that we can actually learn to love for future generations living at this land. And I understand that not everyone has a huge multi-billion-dollar shift happening underway in their cities, but almost all of us, wherever you are in the world, live in a society that is changing in some way, whether it's even just an upgrade to a bicycle path or minor infrastructural changes. And these are all things that are important to bring that optimism and that sense forward that the change that's happening is actually good. And I again spoke about optimism, but I think it's important to recognize that the scale of optimism, if you're just thinking about, say, the Portland's Flood Protection Project in a climate sphere, it's hard to think, this is not going to solve the global climate crisis. The scales are just too different. But if you think about it in terms of improving our society sphere and the local fabric of our relationship to our environment and preserving biodiversity, that is really important and a place where you can get really excited and positive feelings about what we're doing. And you can get a lot more, I think, political support and a lot more public support behind it. So to recap, I talked about 3 reasons that we might stop talking about climate change in museums. 1, climate change is such a politicized and heavily charged space that we can actually exclude some people from the conversations if we start there. 2, once we start thinking about our broader relationship with where we live and the directions we want to take as a society, we can actually get to more interesting conversations about our planetary human relationship that climate change is really just a part of. And then 3, once we talk about those positive things we're doing in terms of actually getting progress that are related to climate change, we can find valid optimism and get more generating of accelerated progress in that front. So now I'm back in the Royal Ontario Museum in the herbariums collection area, and I wanted to talk about not just how we're actually engaging community partners or government partners in terms of speaking beyond climate change, but also thinking about how we can engage our collections in a museum and, in this case, our research as well. So we are lucky at ROM to have a long history of research at Crawford Lake, Ontario. And in front of me is actually a replication of a sediment core from Crawford Lake that was made in the 1980s. For those who aren't aware, Crawford Lake was announced in July 2023 as the candidate GSSP golden spike of the Anthropocene epoch. The Anthropocene is a proposed epoch which would be defined by humanity's impact on the planet. And so the Crawford Lake sediments have been designated as the best place to measure humanity's impact on the planet. And I've been lucky, along with Curator of Plants, Deb Metzger, to be having the sediments from Crawford Lake recently collected as the first item in our climate change collections at ROM. One of the things that's exciting about using Crawford Lake and the Anthropocene as a conversation point, rather than necessarily starting with climate change, is that it's not as emotionally charged as a space. A lot of people are not yet familiar with the idea of the concept of the Anthropocene, but it's also a new conversation that we can have that, again, focuses on this broader idea of how do we exist with the planet. And if we look through Crawford Lake's histories and its sediments, we can actually see interesting examples of how both people locally have lived with the local environment. For instance, Adawandara and Pre-Wendat farmers in the 1290s who were farming maize and sunflowers. Or we can see the impact of colonialism in the 1800s with the purchase of the lake by the Crawford family, who built a sawmill next to the lake. Or we can see the impacts of climate change today, or 1950s we can see the impacts of global nuclear weapons testing and plutonium from that. So we have these really interesting conversations that are both local and extremely and global at the same time. And this is a great way to start having this broader conversation without entering that same charged space as climate change being front and center of every conversation. So to sum up, I hope it's clear by now that when I say that we can stop talking about climate change, I don't mean that we should actually reduce how much we talk about climate change in our museums, but actually think instead about how we broaden the way that we talk about climate change and find ways to express the excitement of climate change progress and moving forward with the progress that's happening in our cities and in our communities around the world, and using museums to bring that to the public. And it doesn't have to be a climate change focused conversation, but there's other ways to actually engage more people and hopefully really accelerate that progress, because that's really what we need right now.